I am Nadia and I'm here to present my MSc research, which is modeling behavioral response of translocated leopard in shared landscape. To understand the context of my research, we will talk first about what's the conservation implications which are happening in India. When we think about it, India is among the highest dense populated country in the world, and with this coupled with infrastructure expansion and urbanization and agriculture is causing the habitat to fragment a lot, and it is very difficult for larger mammals specifically because they move larger distances. And when studies have done ecological niche modeling and occupancy modeling, and they have found out that anthropogenic expansion confines the Indian leopard to human-dominated landscape, which demands in turn increase in their phenotypic plasticity. So they have to adapt their behaviors with landscape, which can obviously have a threshold to it. When it comes to other studies, they have seen how habitat loss is affecting the presence and absence, which is occupancy of leopards, but we haven't seen the temperature effect of it. And when we compile it with translocated stress, it becomes a very interesting problem. So my study is based on four core, my research is based on these four core papers. When we see about the papers which are on this side of the screen, every hill has its leopards. The author found out that in this, the leopards, they were mostly staying in forest or agriculture or rocky outcrop. And then Kolekar and all expanded on this analysis, and they found out that leopards are choosing this kind of habitat. Then when we look at a different study done in China, they found out that precipitation has an impact on where these leopards were moving. So they kind of tried to see how the global warming is affecting the movement of leopards. And all these three papers, they work on ecological niche modeling or occupancy modeling, which has its constraint basically. So for my research, I am combining this with Muhammad's paper, in which he runs a machine learning model, which is called hidden Markov model, and he sees not just where the leopards are present, but how exactly are they moving as well. To understand my research, we'll talk a little bit about my study area. This is my study area, which is approximately 2,400 kilometers square, and it consists of natural habitat, then there are reserve forest, protected areas, and then all the yellow part are basically anthropogenic, which would be settlement here. To understand how dense this study area is, just the study area has a population of almost 9 million. That's basically 370 people per square kilometer. When we talk about my research more, this is an important number to remember here, that no matter where we are talking about how leopards are moving, at the minimum scale, there is at least 370 people present there. Also, one more thing to remember is, in our study area, it's not just leopards. They are also conspecific large predators like hyena, does, and tigers there. So there is that sort of competition pressure acting as well. Then when we move on to the methods which I used GPS collar data, which were for 5 leopards, in which 3 were male and 2 were female, ranging from 3 to 6 years old, and they were monitored between 2014 to 2015. And I ran a continuous time hidden Markovian model with 3 behavioral states. State 1 is, to say it in layman terms, it would be resting. State 2 is intermediate movement, and state 3 is directional movement, and it's basically directional and fast. For our model, we ran 41 model and chose best model depending on AIC score. Even though our AIC score for model temperature with human density in an interactive model had AIC score the best. We didn't choose that, we chose our second best because in a very highly dense place, that was already expected for us that temperature and human density would have the highest effect. And that's what the literature shows as well. And that was not we were trying to find. And the AIC score difference was not a law. So both were really, really good model. And after this, we calculated activity time budgets to see in which state these leopards were staying the most. For our results, this is like for my data, the gray part is how my natural data is, and then the red line is like the normal distribution. We found that like the QQ plot and the pseudo-residual are pretty much how you would expect for a model if it was good. And then we find out in the pseudo-residuals over time as well, there is only one peak, there is an outlier there. It's because of that. So moving on to like this, basically the whole bunch of graphs tells us that, okay, whatever model we ran is good. Now what did we find, right? When it comes to like what we found, so here is again the yellow / orange is state 1, purple is state 2, and green is state 3. Again, state 1 would be like resting and very small movement, random angle. And then state 2 is intermediate web, like step length with again random angle, and state 3 is large step length with directional movement. And we found out that basically 80% of the time these leopards are just moving. So imagine you put this translocated leopard in a place, and then for majority of the time they are moving either intermediately fast or very, very fast, and is again very, very dense place. So that also tells us kind of like you would expect it in terms of translocated leopard, because then again we have to remember that the data is for translocated leopard. So we expect it that it would be more in state 2 and state 3 because it's exploring the area. It doesn't know where the safe space is, or it doesn't know where the risks are. So it's basically kind of exploring the area. Moving on to our next graph, we see that this is day since release. So like how many days has it been since they were released out in the area, and that's the stationary state probability. We see in the beginning state 3 is most. That's also again it confirms what we were saying, that in the beginning it's moving fast. So when we think of, like, suppose if you are thinking of rewilding or translocating an animal, so these are the important thing to think about, that are they going to be moving really, really fast, even if the habitat is fragmented, is there a corridor provided there? And these kind of data help us kind of reiterate these decisions. When it comes to like the p-value for all the interaction for my model, we see that the warmer temperature prompted the state transition from state 1 to state 2. So example, if they were just resting, they started kind of moving, but it stopped them from from second to third one. Like for when they were in intermediate state, it was very unlikely for them to go to the third stage, which is directional movement, like fast directional movement. And we also found out that human density emerged as the strongest and consistent driver of behavioral switching. And we will see this more in terms of a graph later on. When we think of, like, I would like to first focus on the density distribution of step length. When we see the gray one is our step length, like overall data basically, and then again orange is state 1, blue is state 2, and green is state 3. You can see that here the peak is just right there. It peaks when the step length is very small, and then for the third state you see that it gradually decreases here. So that also tells us that, like, when they are moving, the probability density for like smaller step length is very, very high, and then it's like the curves kind of like mellows down when we move into the further like states basically. When it comes to turning angle and its distribution, we see like the second and first state is completely flat. That means that everything, however they were turning, was completely random. And we see for like basically the third state is peaking at 0, which means they are going straight there and it's directional. But what direction is it? It is straight most of the time. That's what basically this is telling us. When it comes to temperature now, we can see, we found this very interesting. So stationary state probability is basically that if a leopard was in state, like for example, if we take the second state, which is the green one, what is like, how likely is it that it's going to stay in the same state? So we can see if it is in second state, as temperature increases here, it goes down. Same goes for the first one. But when it comes to third state, when temperature is increasing, basically at like 38 degrees, it's going upwards. So that is also very, very interesting, and we'll come back to its implication later on. When it comes to human density now, this is again very, very interesting and gives us a lot of idea about like conservation implication when it comes to translocated leopard. First, we can see for the state 1 is decreasing as the number of people are increasing, and this is here. We can see almost at like 250 people per square kilometer. We can see that all of them are intersecting. So if we translocate a leopard where the human density is around this time, it gives them the freedom to change between states. So human density is not just directing that, like for example, if it was really, really dense and we left the leopards there, they would have to, either they would be like in extremely third state because they would be running away from things, but technically from data we found out that it would be in second state when there is a lot of people, because they are being kind of cautious, but they can't as well rest, neither can they run really, really fast because they don't have space. So when like these kind of things help us in deciding how like human density and temperature should be looked upon when we are thinking of translocation or rewilding. Both actually. When it comes to like the conservation implication, we found out that almost 82% of the time they were moving. So that tells us that it is high energy expenditure. And if we, for example, if we were to see, if we translocate a leopard in a very high dense human space, and we have like, for example, it's very fragmented, and then there are like farming involved around the area. So these kind of thing, we can tell that there would be kind of more conflict. So we at least have a threshold of how dense the area should be when it comes to this kind of thing. And we also see that like translocation should like kind of avoid timing in terms of like for example, leopard in peak summer. And then because in peak summer and in humanly dense space, since they are mostly at state 2, they are not able to transition to state 3, and because it is also very physically taxing for them to go into state 3, as it requires more energy. And for any translocation so that like post release they kind of like let go of their energy, we need to see how dense the place has to be, so that, and we should have like a buffer zone, for example, so that it's easier for them to manage their activity time budget. That's it from my side actually. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. My name is Kili Walsh. I will be giving a talk about human and macaque conflict in Indonesian Borneo. This is part of DICE's collaboration with Sangha Bumi Lestari, that I will abbreviate to SBL for the rest of this. The surveys were done by SBL. The questionnaire was co-designed with Joe Hedges' PhD project, and the research permit and ethical clearances were given from Indonesia's Research and Innovation Agency, and I was drafted in through this with my MSc project to work with SBL, as well as my subset of the data. So the area that we're looking at is a large island off of Indonesia. It's actually the, I think, third largest island in the world, and the little red dot is Bentaram, the corridor that I'm specifically looking at. So zooming in, here's the corridor that is nestled in between two national parks. And then you also see the light green as well as the blue are social forests, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in the next slide. The blue is a customary forest, which is a subset of social forests. And the area is mostly inhabited by the Dayak Iban and the Dayak Tamambala people. So what are customary forests? And what is SBL's mission with them? So Indonesia's main mechanism for community forest management is social forestry, which offers 5 permit types. In practice, permits are actually very difficult to obtain without NGO or corporate backing. So uptake is generally lagged because of that. And even where they are granted, communities often lack clarity with the management and how they're able to use them, as well as funding behind them. So the attention has concentrated on 2 conservation-oriented schemes, one of which is customary forests. So within Bentaram, communities unfortunately currently hold no formal management rights over their forests, so that is a huge part of SBL's mission to secure those rights sustainably. And then in SBL's own landscape assessment, crop losses to wildlife and retaliatory hunting to those crop losses are 2 big challenges in this mission. In that vein, hunting rates are linked to food security, and that is one of the claims that my data allows me to test. So before I get into that, why does this question matter? One of those things is macaques have recently been uplisted to endangered, however, are still hugely treated as pests and are rarely a conservation priority. One of these reasons is that they are, in a word, ubiquitous and do also often cause a lot of just conflict around them. However, they're being increasingly pushed into more human-occupied landscape through diminished quality of forests and diminished space of forests surrounding them. On a more like qualitative and quantitative scale, to kind of visualize this research gap of this conservation priority, I did an advanced search query on Scopus, which a caveat for that is this is a English language search, and a lot of the areas that macaques are found are in Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Malaysia. So this is very much an English-centric search. However, I want to highlight the research gap. And so I did an advanced search query on Scopus, came back 307 records of macaque conflict globally, specifically to Indonesia, 28 papers, specific to Indonesian Borneo, 6 papers, and then of my research area in Kalimantan, specifically West Kalimantan, only 1 record. So that's 1 paper on human macaque conflict with crop damage out of 307 records. So there is a huge gap there. And then there's my little appendix. So within Indonesia, specifically this area of Indonesia, income, specifically cash income, does not tell us very much here. What does tell us here is where people fall on access to education, access to health, medical access, living standards, infrastructure and services, the environment, how it's changed, as well as the social cohesion within their communities. This is the well-being index that has been developed and then adapted specifically to Indonesia here. And so essentially what separates these households within this context is not income, it's not earnings, it is access to each one of these. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So as I stated, this was a questionnaire that was developed, and it is a questionnaire that the data, basically the data that I'm using is secondary data. It was originally developed for a research that was examining wild meat consumption within, I think, East Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan, but it was redeployed here to look at conflict. So there are limitations to how I can use the data that I'll go into towards the end of this. 555 households were surveyed, 540 of which had complete data, so that's data with all the variables present. And there were two outcomes with what I was asked. And that is outcome one, which is binary. Was there macaque damage, yes or no? And then outcome two, given there was damage, how was it escalated? Were there, and then how many macaque species were killed? And it's very important for me to note that a species, not individual macaques, because the data is not fine enough to let me know how many individuals were killed. So instead, I looked at the two macaque species that are found within Indonesia. And so I'm going to visualize that here and show you why I pretty much focus only on macaques for the damage. Is that you can see of the households surveyed and of the 340 that reported damage, the vast majority of people reported macaques as being the source, or being the what damage was attributed to, specifically the long-tailed macaque. So I just thought it was a very good visual of how this is essentially a long-tailed macaque problem. Okay. So, as I said, there were 541 households with complete data, so that is what you see at the top of the household surveys. Of those, 340, so that's 63% of who were surveyed, reported macaque damage. And then of that, 221 of those who reported damage killed at least one species in retaliation, and 61 killed both species in response. And this is also essentially a one species problem, if you want to call it that. The pigtailed macaque barely adds any households who are already reporting damage to the long-tailed macaque. One thing I do also want to go back here is that between the 340 who reported damage and the 211 who killed at least one species in response to those damage, that leaves 129 households who reported that same thing, reported crop damage attributed to macaques, but then they did not retaliate in response. And that's one area that I wanted to kind of focus on in this talk, is not why people retaliate, but what separates those two groups that do or don't retaliate. So, going back to that first claim of SBL linking hunting to food security, my first kind of order of business of all of this was to check whether the households that scored lower on the well-being are the ones getting rated, and essentially everything reported back is no. It tested it 4 ways, null every single time. Even when I deliberately did a harder and broader test, it still came back as null. So well-being, at the very least on the household level, does not tell me anything about who gets rated. Okay, but among the farming households, the 340 who reported damage, 5 things were tested, and 3 of those did predict retaliation. The male-headed households have about 2.5 times the odds of escalating. Households reporting increased customary access, about the same, and those who reported frequent forest visits, so that's weekly or monthly, also increased the odds of being likely to retaliate. Education did not do anything here, so it was left off of the figure. And well-being, what I initially set out to test, does appear to be completely flat in this. And it's important to note that it appears completely flat, and I'm going to go into that a little bit in the next slide about how that's a little bit deceptive because of just how the data ends up coming out. Okay, so before I get into the retaliation is not just one decision of killing. It's 2 decisions, and one is kill or don't, and then having killed, does it escalate to both species? Well-being well-being does behave differently on both of those decisions. On the first decision, it does nothing at all. It's completely flat. However, in the second decision, being 1 standard deviation better off, so 1 standard deviation better off roughly doubles the odds of the likelihood to retaliate. And that's kind of why it's a little bit confusing on this at the moment because of kind of the way I've structured my talk and the way I framed this out. I ended up paring down some of my visuals because it was getting a bit bogged down, so I can maybe answer questions about that later if need be. But essentially the reason it looked flat on the previous slide, how it looks, hangs out here, is because it's pointing in two different directions, whether it's between households or between villages. So it's pointing up, pointing down. And so when you average those out, it does come across as flat. So that does bring us back to that 129 that I mentioned in the previous slide, who did not retaliate in response, versus the 211 that did retaliate in response. What separates them is ultimately not well-being, at the very least on the household level versus the village level. So another visual. This is how retaliation varies by village. It's not neat as far as being able to see a clear pattern between them, because as you can see, some of the village, and it's also organized by the highest at the top is those that scored highest on the well-being index, versus at the bottom is those that scored lowest on the well-being index. And you can see here, nearly 100% reported damage from macaques, as well as retaliation to that to some degree. But the pattern is not easy to tell from this visual alone. So, and also with this, as you can see, this is a village I do want to highlight because it did kind of stick out and make some things difficult and sticky with my analyses because it was such a tremendous outlier, and I was puzzling, like, what is it about this village that sticks out? I can't really tell with my data. This would be something that would be worth kind of a future follow-up study, even beyond just the nature of the wild meat consumption, to see why it stood out and what separates it from the rest of them. So to visualize that again, we have this. So each dot is a village. The further left they are, the lower on the well-being score they scored on average. The further up, more households retaliated, and the dot size is how many households were surveyed. Taking at value, it very much looks like worst off villages, specifically V12, have much greater chance of retaliating in response to crop damage. However, it does hang very strongly on V12 as it shoots off really far up into the stratosphere. But if you take that away, everything completely flattens out. Which does seem like a huge problem, but after talking with my supervisor, I was informed that V12 is not in fact one single settlement, but several settlements bundled into a desa to one broader administrative boundary. And so it's not necessarily an unaccountable outlier, but it's just a result of the type of analysis being too coarse for that one case. So if I haven't bungled this too much, essentially that's why I decided that the findings to lean on are not so much the cases between villages, but within the villages instead, because it's just easier to parse out the differences. So moving on to this, what does all of this wonderful, confusing stuff mean for SBL? So, as I mentioned, this is essentially a one species problem. It's a long-tailed macaque that's really carrying a lot of the damage, at least a damage that's attributed to the species. So any management around this should be species specific, not just macaque specific in general. It's the village, not the household necessarily. Villages differ far more than households within them, and so any mitigation measures need to be delivered village by village, as a pilot won't necessarily transfer cleanly between them. The food security link is real, however, it operates between villages, not necessarily between households within villages, so it does need refining. And then lastly, my data did show that increased customary forest access showed an increase in retaliation. However, that is simply because increased community forest management does bring households into more contact with the forest in general. And so conflict mitigation needs to be built proactively instead of retroactively in response as it comes along. And then lastly, as I said, my limitations. So they said the questionnaire is secondary data. Two big things that I don't have are severity and frequency measure. So any loss counts equally, which is also why damage is nearly universally reported. If a macaque damaged one time during the year and only took maybe a single crop versus if it damaged it throughout the year and took crop after crop after crop, it's still given the same amount, yes, no damage. Then also, this is a densely forested landscape, and so the forest cover did come back null. However, that's just because everything is so very forested. So it's not necessary that forest access or forest abundance has no impact on the type of retaliation or the degree of retaliation. It's hard to tell at this scale. So for the next steps, I would make it would be nice to have a questionnaire that's purely focused around conflict, and then especially about how much is lost, how often, and then to what degree, like how many species are actually retaliated against individually. And then have this spatial resolution below the village so they don't have issues like I did with V12 where the administrative boundaries are kind of standing in the way of how I interpret it. And I think that about sums it up. This is a little video of them being cheeky. Yeah, that's about it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. What if saving our planet isn't about creating something new, but actually recognizing something that is already existing? My talk this evening is about other effective area-based conservation measures, commonly known as OECMs. So before I begin my talk, I would actually like to acknowledge the people that have supported this research so far. DICE, the area where I am right now, and the support they have given me. Then also this work was done in Kenya, and we are collaborating with Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association, commonly known as KWCA. And not forgetting E3. So during this project, I was privileged to actually work with a research assistant from Kenya who was being supported by the E3 project. And then, while working in Kenya, I also got affiliated to Strathmore University, which is a local university I am collaborating with on this research. And lastly, I would like to thank my department back home, Department of National Parks and Wildlife, for the opportunity to be here. More thanks, I would actually like to thank the class of 2025 for the support they have offered unto me, and also the discussions that we've had. It's been a beautiful community being at DICE. Not forgetting the E3 team, the project that I'm currently working on, my supervisor Tom, and not forgetting the beautiful Steph, and also the rest of the team. So this evening, my talk is based, I'll talk about the background of OECMs. I'll also look at the global status of these OECMs. And like you saw on the title, I'm looking at Kenya. So why are we looking at Kenya? And lastly, there are some questions that I would like to answer in this research. Moving on, I would like to talk about the methods that I use in coming up with my results, and also the findings of my research, and lastly, the conclusion and some priority solutions. Everyone who is in the house today, we all know how nature is declining, and the onus is upon us. If we are to achieve the global biodiversity target that we couldn't achieve, we have to recognize the efforts of indigenous people and local communities. Nature is providing so much, not only to the ecosystem, but also to us as human beings. But we are seeing how it is declining. So in 2022, countries made and committed to see how they are going to come up with a plan to ensure we reverse and halt the biodiversity loss. So this is the common Montreal Global Biodiversity Target. So this framework actually aims to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. My study area is Kenya. So I just put this mixed report here, which shows how this biodiversity is actually declining. So we can see on my left here, we've seen how conservation success has happened. But on the other hand, we have challenges where we've got critical wildlife that is actually declining. So what are we doing? And most importantly, we only have less than 5 years for us to meet our 2030 targets. So how are we going to close that gap? So the framework sets forth 4 goals and 23 actionable targets. And among these 23 targets, the highlight of this talk is target 3. So what does this target 3 talks about? The target 3 ensures that at least 30% of terrestrial and marine areas should be conserved. And how are we going to do this? In this case, we're going to ensure that these areas are well represented, they are equitably governed, and they are also very effective. So target 3, therefore, has got 3 major themes. So we have protected areas there. We also have OECMs, and we have indigenous and traditional territories. So my talk today is focusing only on OECMs. So what are these OECMs? So OECMs are simply areas that are outside protected areas, and they represent significant targets in ensuring that we meet our targets. The key thing that we need to take away is conservation is mostly about people. The moment we exclude people out of conservation, we are failing. And that is why in our previous targets, we couldn't meet the Aichi targets because people are not included. So OECMs have been brought on board to actually complement and ensure that we try and achieve our 20 by 30 targets. However, this term came on the international scene in 2010. So maybe I would ask the house, how many of you have heard about OECMs in here? Perfect. So this term has been on the international scene in 2010, but then it was only defined in 2018. Despite being defined in 2018, there were lots of issues, and it only got embedded into the target 3 in 2022. And now this is when we are seeing how we are trying so hard to make sure we incorporate and meet our targets. So Kenya, along with other countries, also committed to achieving this target. But how are we going to achieve this target? Here is a simplification of the definition of what an OECM is. So an OECM is simply a geographically defined area other than a protected area. And this area should be governed and managed. In my preamble, I had mentioned to say, what if we can save our biodiversity simply by recognizing something that is already existing and not creating something new? So these areas should be already being managed and governed, and they should achieve positive, sustained, long-term conservation outcomes with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socio-economic, and other relevant values. And one example I would give, one that can qualify to be an OECM, is actually where we are here, University of Kent. So if we know what an OECM is, how then can we tell to say, how does this site qualify to be an OECM, and how does this site get recognized? So there are 4 steps that have been outlined. So the first one, we have to identify the sites. We have to make sure that site should demonstrate evidence-based long-term outcome. The second one, we need to secure consent, especially from indigenous people and local communities, because we are saying these areas, they are outside protected areas. The third step, this site should be assessed against the IUCN criteria. So the IUCN criteria, there are criteria that we need to make sure that this site has to meet those criteria. And lastly, once we recognize, this area has to be reported to the World Database of Protected and Conserved Area so that it is officially recognized. So what does reporting look like? So once the area has been recognized, this is the World Database of Protected and Conserved Areas. So once our site has been recognized, it is going to be documented to this site, and it's going to contribute to us achieving our 30 by 30 target. So looking at OECMs today, what is the global status of these OECMs? And how are we doing as a nation? How are we doing as England? How are we doing as Kenya? So currently, we have 7,432 OECMs documented into the World Database of Protected and Conserved Areas. And together with protected areas, we are now at 18.45. Like I mentioned, we only have less than 5 years for us to meet our 20 by 30 target. So how are we going to seal that gap? Then these OECMs, we must understand that there are two types. There are terrestrial OECMs and also marine OECMs. So in my study, I only focused on the terrestrial OECMs because I am looking at community conservancies. Another key takeaway that I want today is these OECMs, their governance is inclusive, unlike protected areas where we only have governance, which is just the state. So for our OECMs, these ones, they have got the stewardship of local communities. We can have government stewardship. We can also have private and also the shared governance. So as of August 2026, like I mentioned, we had 7,432 OECMs reported. Out of that, you can see on my far left there, we have governance, which are being managed by the government, the shared, private, and also by local communities. So if you look at the percentage which is being done by communities, it is actually very, very minimal. It's actually less than 2%. So this is why my study focuses now. Why are we having low numbers of OECMs reported? Why are we having low numbers of OECMs that are being governed by local communities being reported so low on this world database? And yet, this is where we have communities. So according to the report by IPBS 2019, it actually says at least a quarter of the world land is managed and owned by communities. So why are we then, if we're having so much land, why are we not having most of these OECMs being managed by communities? So my research is also focusing on the already existing conceptual framework. We are looking at the conceptual framework of operationalization with IUCN. So already looking at the literature that we have documented some barriers that are preventing these OECMs. So these barriers are not Kenya specific. These are barriers which are already on the international scale. So the first barrier is that these OECMs, the concept is still very new. Hence, communities don't have much information about what OECMs are. Even in this room, when I asked, not even half of the room know about OECMs. Now imagine someone who is in the villages. So that's the barrier number one. The second one is where we have insufficient resources and capacity to develop national framework. Because we need capacity, people to be trained on how to assess. We saw those steps that we have for an OECM to be recognized. We do not have people who are well trained into reporting on these OECMs. We don't have people who are well trained to undertake national frameworks. And one critical thing is these are areas outside protected areas. It is infringing on the land of communities. I'll give an example of Kenya. Kenya has had a history where people were evicted from their land. So bringing in a new concept which hinges on their land, they have got lots of fears. If a new concept is coming, there will be its conservation. The first thing they will fear is their land is going to be taken out. That is what is globally. And also, they are looking at the benefits. What benefits are we going to take? These are only anticipated benefits. And how are they going to materialize? And lastly, there is also difficulty in how these areas are being governed. Like we saw on the governance, we've got community governance, we have shared governance. It is not clear how this governance is being done, especially for communities. So like I mentioned, my study area is Kenya. So why are we talking about Kenya? So Kenya, despite having a well-established ecosystem, Kenya has actually recorded no OECMs. We don't have any. So moving on, I was actually answering two questions. What are some of the barriers, the main barriers to why Kenya, despite having a well-established ecosystem, has not recorded any OECMs? And my second question, how do these barriers differ from different stakeholders? So my study area, I was looking at the conservancies in Kenya. So currently, Kenya has got 230 community conservancies. So these conservancies, they actually amount to a total land mass of 18%. So we can see when they have no OECMs, how it's going to contribute in achieving the 20 by 30 target. So if we talk about the community conservancy, what is it? So this is simply land set aside for wildlife conservation. It could be a community land, private land, or shared land. So during my data collection, I used purposive sampling to conduct my interviews. And also in some cases, I did focus group discussions. For my analysis, I used NVivo 15. And also for visualization, I used Gepi software with the help of Tina, the PhD student who just finished and she'll be presenting next month. So this was me during interviews. Like I mentioned, I interviewed conservation NGOs. I also interviewed government officials and community as well, just to get an understanding of how they understand these OECMs. So this was me at Choke Wildlife Conservancy, Mara North, just to get an understanding of how they understand these OECMs. So here the elephant had actually dropped that placard, so the guys were trying to lift it. So look, going through my results. So I actually interviewed 22 stakeholder participants. And from those 22, 3 were from Kenyan government, 10 communities spread across the conservancies, and 9 from conservation organizations. So what did we find out? Because we're looking at the barriers. So here, these are some of the barriers that I found out in my study. So if we check the one on top there, so the bigger the circle, the more, that's how much people talked about that barrier. So the number one barrier people talked about is awareness. Sorry, I just circled awareness, but if you check on the themes there is low awareness and understanding of OECMs. People don't know much about these OECMs. And as long as they don't know, they cannot give consent. The second barrier was a lack of a national framework for Kenya, and also fear of loss of land rights. The other thing is insufficient benefits, and there's also community exclusion in national processes. And lastly, inadequate funding and capacity development. So these were just some of the quotes from the participants. So this one said, awareness is number one. If you don't know, you cannot progress or convince anyone. The level of awareness on OECMs is so low. And she admitted to say, it is not only at the community level, but across all the 3 stakeholder groups, government and the civil society as well. Then the other one talked about funding. The major challenge we have been facing as a nation is funding, because just convening a meeting, talking about OECM is quite expensive. So that is just the other. Then the other one I wanted to talk about was also on, so Kenya undertook its first site assessment to just test the OECM 2. So after conducting this assessment, they actually found that that conservancy is already reported as a protected area. So already, like I mentioned, this OECM should not be a protected area. So already, that conservancy cannot qualify to be an OECM. But as a conservancy, you can still apply to change that designation. So these were just some of the themes. So to answer my research question number 2, I looked at what are the different barriers in community for these stakeholders. So others talked of low awareness, and others talked of having community exclusion, mostly was for community. But everyone, all the participants, the number one barrier was low awareness and understanding of these OECMs. So, like I explained, these were just the findings, just explaining what people felt. And communities just felt like capacity building is mostly for government and NGOs because communities are not getting the capacity to learn about these OECMs. And some of the solutions from these participants were they need to conduct a national sensitization and awareness programs for the OECM. And also they need to develop a sustainable mechanism funding and a national OECM working group. So to conclude, I would just like to tell everyone here, this is not a roadmap. If we are to achieve these targets, we have to have a transformative mind and a rethink. And it is a challenge to all of us. How are we going to do this? We have to widen our definition. Let's get time to know what these OECMs are and how they can complement protected areas in achieving our 30 by 30 target. And most importantly, we need to honor communities who are already protecting what's already existing. And above all, in as much as we are investing in nature, we should invest in trust for these communities. Thank you.